Approval ratings of government agencies and politicians are at or near record lows. An increasing number of people now identify and register as independents. The number of voters who identify as independents is now on par nationally with the two major parties. Despite this, many large media groups bolster the idea of a constant race between the left and the right. This can leave those in the middle feeling like they're left without a voice. And many people question the role of media in shaping opinions. Media coverage can affect the political process as well as determining the outcome of elections. How much influence media exerts and what role it plays is a matter of debate. Ben SWANN is an Emmy award-winning journalist, formerly of WXIX Fox 19 of Cincinnati. While there, he was the first journalist to publicly question President Barack Obama over the so-called presidential kill list. He is now the host of Full Disclosure with Ben SWANN. He's here to talk to us today about the state of media and their role in world events. Welcome to the show, Ben.
Thank you, Gary. Thanks for having me on.
Ben, is there really a left or right-wing conspiracy, if you will, in the media?
Well, I don't know if it's so much a conspiracy. I think there is a left versus right paradigm that media has been operating under for about 15 years. It's a good business model for a lot of media, because if you can play folks who feel like they're on the right against those who are on the left and vice versa, you create essentially groups of people who don't necessarily challenge what you're saying, but go to you to be validated in their own line of thinking. Look, I honestly believe that most people do not watch news or media to be informed. They go there to be validated in the belief system they already hold. And so if you are someone who leans to the right, you'll go to Fox because you believe Fox is going to validate what you already believe. It's the same thing with internet media and blogs. You go to Daily Caller or Breitbart, or you go to Mother Jones, depending on which side of the political spectrum you fall on. And what you're expecting from those folks is that whatever stories they run are going to validate your worldview.
Now, Ben, terms that are thrown around a lot are national media or mainstream media. Could you help our viewers by defining what those terms actually mean?
Well, I think it's becoming a little more blurred because of the internet. But essentially, mainstream media, the idea is that really encompasses the three major networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC. Fox Network, News Network on cable, still refers to that media as mainstream, even though Fox is just as mainstream as anybody. And not that there's anything wrong with being mainstream media. You know, it's almost become kind of a slur in our culture to talk about the mainstream media. And I think that politicians have used that term quite a bit. People like Sarah Palin use it kind of as a slur. There's nothing wrong with being mainstream, but I think what we're finding more and more is that mainstream, it really encompasses what people as the viewer or the reader or the listener begin to determine as a credible source of media. So there's lots of different media out there. There are a lot of blogs, there are lots of internet sites, but would the average American believe that those forms of media are trustworthy? And so mainstream has become the term I think that we use for trusted media, even though most Americans don't really trust that media anymore. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic that I think we're seeing play out.
I want to get into that trust issue in just a moment, but how is journalism changing as reporters become the news, as in the case of Glenn Greenwald being the sounding board for Edward Snowden? Now we see that Greenwald's partner was recently detained at an airport, and all of his materials and USB sticks and computers were seized and searched just by being an associate or a partner of that journalist.
Right. Well, I think that what we saw happen with Greenwald's partner is kind of becoming par for the course. I mean, if you can't necessarily go after that one journalist, which, by the way, they have gone after Glenn Greenwald in a number of ways. I believe it was on Piers Morgan tonight when Alan Dershowitz and Piers Morgan had a debate back and forth about whether or not Glenn Greenwald actually hates America. And so there was a lot of debate about kind of where he stood. Look, one of the things that we've done in media today is we've decided that you have to, as a journalist, be advocating for some side, either the right side or the left side. And so it's always about kind of punishing that journalist by looking at what are they trying to accomplish here. And so in Glenn Greenwald's case, by interviewing Edward Snowden, by being the voice of the information he was putting out, who is he really trying to help? Is he trying to help the Russians? Is he trying to help the Chinese? Alan Dershowitz actually says that in that interview, he says Glenn Greenwald loves totalitarian governments and he loves tyrannical regimes. Really? So the idea here is that Glenn Greenwald, because he can't just be a journalist, has to be out there attempting to prop somebody up. And in this case, Glenn Greenwald reveals the NSA prison program because he loves tyranny. That was the claim that was made. It plants seeds in people's minds. It's always that media is attempting to sway you in some way. Sometimes a journalist is just trying to be a journalist. They're just trying to reveal information that they believe the public has a right to. And I think that's what Greenwald was doing.
Let's talk about the war on drugs and how the media plays a role in it. For example, just recently, CNN Sanjay Gupta has been actively investigating the health benefits of marijuana. Obviously a controversial topic, but we're seeing that media outlet move forward with it. And we've aired multiple interviews with advocates for marijuana and health, and aired documentaries on this station as well. So how do you feel that the media plays, what role it plays with the war on drugs?
Well, I think the media sits back and really, in a lot of cases, attempts to gauge the blood pressure, if you will, the feeling of the nation as a whole before they take a stand on anything. So the fact that Sanjay Gupta was able to come out and talk about the fact that essentially he has, reported wrong information over the years or failed to look at the facts of dealing with cannabis, when he talked about that on CNN, you have to believe that somebody higher up said, it's okay, you're allowed to say this. And that's not to say everything that they say is censored, but I think there's always been a very careful area there in terms of controlling what kind of message gets out. So when it comes to the war on drugs, most media will not talk about cannabis. They certainly don't talk about hemp, which is a fascinating subject in and of itself, because the United States is the #1 importer of hemp around the world, and yet it's illegal to grow it here. And state after state, by the way, right now is using nullification to nullify federal law and saying we're going to institute hemp farming in our states again because it's a great cash crop and it's an extremely useful crop. Kentucky's done that. Maine has done that. Vermont just did that. We had a story up at benswan.com about this. What's interesting is that most national media won't talk about the hemp issue at all. They kind of, and if they do, it's always to find some rally with about 12 people and someone who looks as strange as possible and interview that person. So there is definitely an influencer that goes along with media in how they portray this. When they talk about drugs, many times they do find the less mainstream person to interview, the person who looks a little more on the fringe, and that becomes the representation of those people. I think one thing media does a very powerful job of, whether it's good or bad, they do a powerful job of framing an argument based upon who they talk to and how they deal with people, and I think it can be troublesome.
Now, Ben, you mentioned that somebody higher up at CNN perhaps green-lighted this investigation and disclosure of the benefits of cannabis by Sanjay Gupta.
Yeah.
Yourself being inside a local Fox affiliate and brushing shoulders with the national Fox News team, did they ever draw a line and declare certain topics were off limits?
We did not really have that issue in the station that I was working at. I don't know exactly how that plays out, especially at a CNN. But again, I think most of what these networks do isn't so much based on conviction or feeling as it is on what they think the audience will respond to. I think CNN was very calculated in doing this because the attempt was to say, we realize there's a very, very young group of viewers who are not watching CNN that we want to draw into watching us. And so how do we do that? Well, we have to look at generational issues, and cannabis is definitely a generational issue. The facts are behind it. The facts support it. But a lot of people who are older viewers don't care about those facts because they've already been trained through media to believe that all drugs are bad and will ultimately kill you, except for the ones that are being sold across a pharmacist's desk. So it's kind of a strange, way that media has framed all of this. But I do think there's definitely, within the confines of those big media conglomerates, they're very calculated in how they do things. They don't just go out and say, well, let's just talk about cannabis today and see where that goes. And let's talk about this today and see where that goes. Everything they say is very, very careful. And I think that, certainly for Sanjay Gupta to talk about that, someone told him that was going to be acceptable for the network.
Now, Ben, have Americans lost faith in the national media?
Yeah, in a word, yes. I think they have. I think there are two things happening, though. One is, yes, the average person, I think, believes that national media and media as a whole is no good. I think they see us as tabloid, disinterested in facts, much more interested in pushing a political point of view
and again,
advocating.
And again, I don't mean to interrupt, but defining the national media as ABC, CBS, NBC, Fox,
CNN, MSNBC, correct. And Washington Post, New York Times, all those groups. National media, when we talked about this earlier, mainstream obviously is more of like those broadcast networks, but national media is anybody who has a national platform. So anyone who's on cable. I mean, technically Al Jazeera is national media right now, even though they're brand new and just starting up. So I think what we're seeing take place here is people looking at those media sources and saying, we just don't really trust them. We don't trust what they're saying. We don't trust how they're saying it. Because we think they absolutely have some end goal that they're trying to reach. And that's what's frustrating for people, is they don't trust that media actually just is seeking out truth. And I'll give you an example just in the last couple of days where this has come out. So John Kerry, Secretary of State John Kerry, comes out, I believe yesterday, and makes this statement saying that, number one, the United States absolutely believes that a chemical weapon was used in Syria. And number two, that the Assad regime absolutely used it because, number three, they're the only ones with chemical weapons. And these statements are flatly false. There is no evidence of who used a chemical weapon. There's no evidence yet of what kind of weapon was used. And there is evidence that al-Nusra Front, the al-Qaeda wing of al-Qaeda in Iraq, now in Syria, al-Nusra Front, actually was caught with sarin gas back in May of this year by Turkish authorities. For the Secretary of State to stand up and say that is flatly wrong. And yet our media doesn't call him on it. Nobody in national media so far has stood up and raised their hand and said, wait a minute, Secretary of State Kerry, you're wrong when you say that. Instead, they just regurgitate what he says because he's the Secretary of State. If Fox stands up and says that, people say, well, they're just saying that because they're against, the Obama administration. If CNN gets up and goes along with him, people say, well, it's because they don't want to challenge him. And so there's this big problem in America today where people just say, I don't trust these guys. And we have to work to restore that. We have to change the focus of the American people by giving them truth, regardless of how uncomfortable it may make us. As a journalist, as a reporter, you and I have a job of presenting information to people in a way that is clear and concise and does not include how we feel. It's just the facts of what's happening. And when we reach that point, people can then trust us to say, I trust that you're not going to give me your opinion. You're going to give me the facts regardless of whether or not you're comfortable with those facts.
Ben, what groups are trying to influence the media?
Well, I think everyone's trying to influence the media, and I think the media is trying to influence in return. Political groups, obviously, from Republicans and Democrats, are trying to influence how media report stories. They want to certainly keep it in a left-right paradigm because it benefits them, they both believe. You have politicians attempting to influence it. You have lobbyists attempting to influence media because they're obviously working all the time. Look, there's almost 13,000 lobbyists working in Washington, D.C. It's a $3.3 billion a year industry. Well, it's one thing to try to change laws and to influence politicians, but you also want to influence how the public feels and how the public thinks. And so I think there's certainly work that's done to try to influence the message that gets out. Certainly, we were talking about the issue of cannabis a few minutes ago. Pharmaceutical companies certainly would not want to see the legalization of marijuana. They wouldn't want to see the legalization of any drugs other than the drugs that they spend millions of dollars a year creating and marketing and selling.
Now, Ben, let's talk about citizen journalism. We live in an age of information. You can fire up a blog, you can push out a tweet, you can update your status, you can upload a video to YouTube, and that information can go completely viral around the world within seconds of it being added to the web. What role will citizen journalism play on influencing the national media?
Well, I think they're already beginning to do that. I think there are so many folks out there right now who are working as journalists. I prefer to call them independent journalists because they're not connected to a conglomerate of some kind. But I think there's also a war going on over that issue. Look, Dianne Feinstein just made a statement recently. Senator Feinstein was saying that we have to determine who is an actual journalist these days in order to decide whether or not shield laws cover them. So if you or I, as independent journalists, if we were to have a source who is within the government and we reported what they had to say, a shield law essentially says that I don't have to give up my source even if I'm called into court because I'm protected as a journalist. What she's saying is, no, 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 unless you work for a corporation of some kind, you cannot be protected by those shield laws. And that's what she wants to see happen. Well, that's a very dangerous precedent because essentially you're saying we're going to decide who gets to tell these stories and who doesn't. And then if we have influence over a very small group of conglomerates, you know, whether it be News Corp or Time Warner or whoever, if we can influence them, and that's what her hope is, I'm not saying they do influence them, but they hope to influence them, then it makes their job a lot easier in government. And so what you don't want is to start saying, well, we have only a few people who are actual journalists and everybody else is just kind of giving their opinion out there. Many times independent journalists break stories that national journalists are not, and I think we'll see that more and more. You know, the Edward Snowdens of the world aren't going to go to the New York Times, and they aren't going to go to CNN, and they aren't going to go to ABC News because they don't trust them. They're going to have to trust smaller independent journalists who they can gain their trust over time and then reveal this information in order to get it out to the public. So it's a very important step that we keep independent journalists independent and that we recognize that they are just as valid of a journalist as anybody.
Now, you mentioned Dianne Feinstein, and my question now is, how much influence does media have in shaping government, or is it now government shaping media?
Well, I think that right now it is government attempting to shape media. Government works very hard to shape media. I think they always do that. I think media attempts to shape government. But I think right now we have a kind of a strange coalition taking place between media and government, where we do have certain media acting to influence people because they want to seem like an advocate for one side or the other. I think that was a good strategy maybe 10 or 15 years ago, but it was a short-term strategy. Long-term, I think it's been detrimental to the industry, and I think it's been detrimental to journalists as a whole. I think right now we need to see change happen where we step away from political parties and say we're not going to defend or attack a party based on its label. We're going to hold politicians accountable and speak truth to power, regardless of which side of the political spectrum you fall on.
Now, Ben, let's look forward now. How do you see media changing in the coming years, and what's your role going to be in that?
Well, I think media is changing, certainly. I think we're going to see more and more on the internet. I think people as a whole, look, if you follow the trends of entertainment has become virtually completely on demand. So if you have someone who's interested in watching a certain TV show or certain movies, they don't want to have to wait for it, you know, and make appointment television. You know, you have so many folks now who they want to watch it on demand. They want to watch through streaming sites. They want to be able to pick what they're going to watch, when they're going to watch it. I think news will have to follow that pattern as well. That's ultimately going to be detrimental to the old system of news delivery. It has to be changed because you can't expect people to come to you when you're ready to tell them what's happening. You've got to be willing to respond to them. I also think that we're going to see people stepping away from kind of the headline news, if you will, where headlines are read to them all the time. And they want to get context for what's going on. And so it's kind of a balance that's taking place there between balancing, you know, those who need to speak immediately to a subject, but also those who have to provide context to it. And that's what we want to do. You know, you asked our role in that. The role that I hope to play is to restore a lot of context to the national conversation. I think there's too many headlines being read out there without context. Too much that's being said without being challenged. And so we want to be a voice, you know, in media that essentially challenges the status quo, challenges what politicians have to say, not because they're blue or red, but because we believe that ultimately they are servants of the people. They're not aristocracy. And they need to stop being treated as aristocracy and start being treated as servants and being expected to provide answers and information and respond to the people rather than dictating over them.